So, I'm sure that most people who play music, write songs, and who use the internet at all are aware of the idea most famously talked about by Adam Neely that repetition legitimizes.
Repetition legitimizes.
Now, Adam is hardly the first person to point this out. Blues and folk guitarist Jorma Kaukonen was essentially saying the same thing when he said, if you make the same mistake 3 times, that becomes your arrangement. And bass player Mark Miller talks about it in this video where he discusses improvising solos. Basically, it's not a new idea, but Adam's videos on it are the kind of cultural touchstone thanks to his eloquent way of explaining things, so I'll be picking up where he left off. So, in this video, I shamelessly steal, though I prefer the term repeat, Adam's idea and run with it a little. As far as I can tell, Adam only really talks about this concept in the context of improvisation. For example, you make a mistake, you repeat it a couple times, it stops sounding like a mistake. And in a few short examples where he takes a sort of unmusical voice clip, samples it, and turns it into music.
You play something wrong once, it's a mistake. You play something wrong twice, it's music. Twice, it's music. Twice, it's music. Repetition legitimizes. Twice, it's music. Repetition legitimizes.
In one of his videos on the subject, Adam mentions an article by Elizabeth Margulis from the Music Cognition Lab at Princeton, which I would also recommend reading. It explores and explains some of the science done on how repetition, even of non-musical sounds, sort of musicalizes them, and we can start to hear simple spoken word samples as music just by looping them. I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle though. I'm going to go through this concept and how I think about it, explaining it with some examples, and taking us through 3 main lessons that I've identified for songwriting. Okie dokie, so let's start off with lesson number 1. Which really just starts at the same place as Adam's point, that mistake repeated isn't a mistake, it's music. So let's take a simple chord progression. In fact, let's take a static vamp on E, and say I'm improvising over that. One of the most common or the most easily made mistakes for a rock guitarist is simply a poorly intoned bend. Everyone makes this mistake when they're playing, it just happens. So if you repeat the poorly intoned bend, now it actually starts to sound good. That's cool, huh? So this is actually something you hear a lot in rock, metal, and blues styles. The poorly intoned bends can add a bit of an edge or tension to a solo, and someone like Jimmy Page in particular did this a lot. The thing is though, this doesn't merely need to be done accidentally. It's not inherently a mistake, though technically wrong, and indeed is often purposely done. So this first lesson is really just about taking something that doesn't technically work or make sense according to our expectations or understanding of the music we're listening to, like bending a note in tune, and repeating it, which makes it work. So we could actually revise our first lesson from repeat a mistake and it is no longer a mistake to repeat something that doesn't work and it will probably work. So we've sort of abstracted a broader point from the original one to cover purposeful decisions to play something wrong. Let's look at this. When I'm teaching music, in the first or second lesson with a new student, I like to do a sort of casual ear training test thing. I basically noodle a bit within a certain key, playing notes that fit according to a straightforward sort of diatonic harmony. Maybe chords like C, F, G, A minor. I then ask the student to tell me when I play a note or a chord that sounds wrong. I tend to throw in something odd, say a D flat major in the middle of a chord progression in C, or I just flatten the 5th on the 6th chord. People invariably spot the out note, even people who tell me that they're tone deaf or know nothing about music. So let's just stick with one example. That D flat I played before really sticks out like a sore thumb when played like that, right? But if I just play C, D flat a few times, well, that works. That actually sounds pretty cool, huh? Even if we do this with, say, C and F sharp, 2 chords, a tritone apart, that actually sounds quite good if we just keep repeating it. It works because we've repeated it. It's that simple. Even though it doesn't really work according to the basic usual understanding of diatonic harmony, we've made it work. When we listen to music, or look at art, or read a poem, or watch films, we're ultimately looking for a sort of logic to the structure, form, or narrative. Abstract art, ungrammatical poetry, or even poetry from another language that we just don't understand, collage films, these can still affect us because they still have their own internal logic that we can pick up. Sometimes it takes a bit of conscious interpretation, but often not. So that's really just what we've done with the C to F sharp chord progression. Listening to it, you know that that movement is occurring and it becomes normal. Repetition has legitimized it. I'll play you now a bit of a song that I recorded last year called It's Always Raining Here. I wanted to create a sort of floaty, chilled vibe during the verses, so I started with a simple progression that didn't really move much. A minor 7, C major 7 to F major 7.
If I had known what it would do to you, I would never say goodbye.
It's a pretty boring progression given how little change there is between those chords. Anyway, I realised it needed to do something, so I just tried modulating it up to C minor and realised it would sound good to just repeat the same chord progression starting there. Okay, but then where next? Well, why don't I just keep modulating that very simple, actually quite boring progression up a minor third each time? So I tried that.
If I had known the right thing to do, you know I'd have tried.
It doesn't actually make sense particularly from a music theory point of view, but that doesn't really matter. The logic simply becomes move the whole thing up a minor third each time. By repeating it, that harmonic development just starts to make sense. It makes as much sense in this song as hearing the dominant tonic resolution that we've heard a million times and unconsciously internalized, simply because it's repeated consistently through the verses. Though I'm sure we could explain this verse chord progression using the normal language of harmony, ultimately, it just comes down to what I've just said. We recognize a consistent logic and understand, without necessarily consciously understanding, where it will go next. It just goes up in minor thirds. I still think, though, that we can develop this first lesson a little bit further. We currently have repeat something that doesn't work, and it will probably work. But doesn't work is broader than just outside of diatonic or functional harmony, or dissonant, or a mistake. What if we generalize this further to also include anything that doesn't work just particularly well? What the hell am I talking about? This point is probably best demonstrated with a specific example. Roundabout by Yes is one of my favourite songs ever, and it has a very, very subtle and ultimately, taken by itself, unimpressive theme that runs through much of the track. This theme doesn't really work very well individually, but because it's repeated in different sections, it creates a sense of continuity throughout the track. Throughout the verses, we have this harmonic riff, in E minor on the guitar. Played more straightforwardly with fretted notes, it goes like this. In the choruses, we modulate to G, and then we're playing a nice little G Mixolydian riff. So the same lick reappears, but this time modulated nicely to a new key center. So, although this motif is incredibly simple and by itself doesn't really do much, the way it is employed in the verses and the choruses, but each time in a different key, just elevates it into something that really holds the entire track together.
This rug I have, it really tied the room together.
And remember, this is a nearly 9-minute long progressive rock song. Something has to hold it together. Yes, do similar things in Close to the Edge and elsewhere. A simple motif repeated throughout a long, complex piece in order to ground it. So, having developed this idea a bit further, we now basically have repeat something until it works better, which started as Neely's repeat a mistake and it's no longer a mistake. Sometimes this means repeating a harmonic or melodic move that doesn't immediately make sense in order to create this new sort of logic. Sometimes it means repeating a mistake made while improvising, and other times it can simply mean repeating a relatively unimpressive motif or theme in a way that gives it new life. Cool. So, let's take this idea further still and move towards our second lesson. You see, repeating something until it works, well, this is quite simply just how culture works. And this is why, or how, we have traditions. It's how genres form and conventions perpetuate. So this next lesson is not just about repeating what we've done ourselves 2 seconds ago, it's about repeating what others have done. So, lesson 2, steal, repeat what has already been done. As they say, there's nothing new under the sun. This cliche not only speaks to the inevitability of repeating what's already been done, but is literally an example of it. It's a cliche, one we've probably all heard a million times. So the point here is to embrace this reality when it comes to writing songs. It's only by embracing and accepting it that you'll ever be able to move beyond mere copying. So there are two elements to this lesson. And the first one is to just repeat what others have done. So this can be as simple as repeating phrases or bits of music or lyrics from other songs. This happens a lot. Joni Mitchell quotes Jingle Bells at the start of River. Gautier quotes Baba Black Sheep all the way through Somebody I Used to Know. Bob Dylan uses a line from Scarborough Fair in The Girl from the North Country. The Beatles literally lifted an entire bass line from a Chuck Berry song. Loads of musicians quote Jimi Hendrix's Third Rock from the Sun during their jams. And of course, something else that Adam Neely likes to talk about, the lick. Loads of musicians, particularly jazz, blues, and funk musicians, quote this lick. And sampling someone else's work is literally just a version of repeating it. Rap and other genres that are very sample heavy demonstrate how effectively just repeating what has already been done in the most literal sense can be done in an interesting and innovative way and as an inherent part of the genre and subculture. Take, as an extreme example, a song like Frontier Psychiatrist by the Avalanches. It is almost entirely composed of samples and it works fantastically well. So this happens outside of music too. The most obvious example I can think of is the Wilhelm scream, which appears in loads of films. We've all heard it. So, as you can see, everyone does it, and so should you. Doing this develops a sense of continuity between your songwriting and the wider world of music and culture beyond you. It's also a shorthand way of invoking an emotion or a mood that everyone understands. This can be done in a straightforward way or in a slightly subversive way that transforms the quoted music. So, to me, Dylan quoting Scarborough Fair in Girl from the North Country sounds quite straightforward, whereas there's something askew or subversive, maybe transformative, in the way that Gautier quotes Baba Black Sheep, a nursery rhyme, in a song about a tumultuous relationship. Anyway, repeating what others have done doesn't just mean directly lifting specific bits of musical lyrics. It's also, quite simply, the very definition of genre and convention. So, back to what I said earlier with the example of ear training with new students, the reason they know which notes fit and which ones don't is because they've unconsciously internalized Western harmony to the point that even though they don't know they know it, they do kind of know it, or at least their brain does. This is culture. Language, for example, is the same. We don't actually learn grammar via academic studies, but by listening to the way other people speak when we're young. It's the act of repetition, hearing something over and over and then repeating it ourselves, that creates genre conventions and even culture more broadly. There's nothing inherently correct or true in those conventions, but they've been repeated to the point that it becomes the norm. Back to the lick. There's nothing inherent to that lick that makes it the lick. It's just because loads of people repeated it. Now, I'm sure that there's probably a parallel universe that instead of this, we're all referring to this as the lick. And of course, we'll all be lizard folk and we'll live underwater, but that's not important right now.
That's not important right now.
The specific example I used earlier of going from C to D flat actually works not just by the immediate repetition of the chord change which legitimizes it, but because we've already heard that sort of movement before. Every music student I play it to recognizes it as sounding a bit Spanish or vaguely Middle Eastern, and that's precisely because it is. I'm not going to explain it to you all here now, but I'm sure you can all instinctively hear that, even if you don't yet understand why. Music is not the only medium that works this way. Everything does. Take food, for example. You all know I love a good food analogy. There's nothing objectively correct about the way in which we make, say, pizzas, or the ingredients that we tend to use them. But because certain ingredients were, and other foods weren't, available or preferred in Italy when the dish was developed, they're not really seen as proper or correct on a pizza. Have you ever seen an Italian react to pineapple on a pizza? So, that's how generic conventions work, through repetition and variation. We'll get to that later. Okay, so there is also a second element to this second lesson. If repeating what others have done is how we engage with, create, and develop culture, what are we doing if we just repeat what we've already done? Huh? So, I'm not just recommending you rip others off, I'm now saying you should rip yourself off? Bear with me a minute, I'll take you through some examples. Right, so for example, Mike Oldfield is a British progressive rock and folk artist who started his career in 1973 with his most famous, but not necessarily his best album, Tubular Bells. It's a brilliant album and is one of the biggest selling in British history. I'm sure that even if you don't know it, you'll recognise the opening theme from its use in The Exorcist. Interestingly, Mike Oldfield briefly quotes the same motif at the beginning of his 1982 song 5 Miles Out. He also adapts the same motif in both his tracks Crises and Harbinger. So he basically just repeats himself across albums, decades apart. So to take another example, the Beatles' music, I'm pretty sure you've heard of them guys, is full of this sort of self-referentiality, both lyrically and musically. Take Glass Onion from the White Album. This song lyrically references past Beatles songs: Strawberry Fields, Man on the Hill, Fixing a Hole, Lady Madonna, I Am the Walrus. Not only that, but it quotes a bit of music from Man on the Hill, the little recorder bit. They actually did the same thing in an arguably even more extreme way with their earlier song, All You Need Is Love, which references loads of other music, from the French national anthem to Glenn Miller's In the Mood, and loads more, as well as other Beatles songs, Yesterday, and most obviously in the coda, She Loves You. So what am I getting at here? What happens when an artist repeats their own lyrics or music in another song? Well, I think it helps create a sort of internal cultural world specific to them and their work. Just like repeating a musical phrase or chord progression that doesn't technically work creates a new internal logic within that one song, and repeating others' ideas, lyrical or musical, is how culture is made or engaged with. Repeating your own ideas across songs creates a sort of internal continuity, a sort of sub-culture of your own. This is actually quite common. It's not just Mike Oldfield and the Beatles who did or do it. I'm sure that some of your favourite artists do the same, or your favourite writers or filmmakers. So if you can think of any examples, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. The point here, basically, is twofold. A, to get comfortable with the fact that repeating what's already been done is an inevitability in putting any art together. And B, embrace this as a good thing that helps you write songs and compose. Our final lesson 3 is a simple one. It's just be smart about it. This lesson is an important one as it sort of tempers the previous two. It's all well and good me saying repeat a thing until it works and steal ideas from other people and yourself. But there are limits to this, right? Firstly, it's all dependent on legality. I'm not actually encouraging you to plagiarize people. Now, where the precise lines between homage, influence, generic convention, and plagiarism lie is actually impossible to say. But don't just take, for example, Bohemian Rhapsody, change a few lyrics and go, well, lol, repetition legitimizes. That's not what I mean. Absolutely not what I mean. I think you all realize that though. I hope. Secondly, this is all genre dependent. Different genres have different expectations of the ways and the extent of repeating cliches and conventions. So in folk, you can literally just take a traditional song and change the lyrics a bit, or take the lyrics from another song and add a new melody. There's no massive expectation to do more than use the same 3 or 4 chords that most folk songs use. You can do much more, of course, and lots of people do, but you don't have to. There are even brilliant and well-respected folk artists who I really like out there who never write a single original song. They simply cover, also known as repeating, others' songs, but in their own ways. And to take another very different genre, like jazz, you definitely should not just repeat someone else's solo, or even really repeat your own, at least note for note, but you definitely are expected to learn the standards and be able to play them inside out. So, each genre has its own way of repeating what's gone before, but you need to understand how to do that in the genre that you're working in. So, repetition generally is really all about just standing on the shoulders of giants and that sort of thing. Here I go again with another cliche. But seriously, even though it's true, as I said earlier, that in music and culture there is nothing truly new under the sun, and that we should embrace and accept that what we are doing will always inherently be repeating what others do, this is only true up to a point. Cultures, art forms, genres, and conventions clearly do evolve and change. It's why variation is important. Whether we're talking about repetition within just one song, or repetition of someone else's motif, even of our own, we need to make sure that there's at least a variation in some way going on. We can go back to our pizza analogy. There are loads of different types of pizza, different schools of thought on how to make one. The Italians, I'm sure, disagree very strongly with the New Yorkers, who disagree with the Detroiters, who disagree with... You get the point. Each different type of pizza developed out of someone just repeating the pizza they already knew and changing it out of necessity or preference a little bit at a time. And we now have all these styles. Now, if you ask me, having a range of options is always better than just having the one. Music is the same, hence why all my examples above involve variation alongside the repetition. So, repeat things, but do it smartly, do it well, add variation. And remember, all of this rests on personal taste. Some people dislike the blues because every song sounds the same. That's what they say, at least. Others dislike sample-heavy music, others dislike repetitive dance music, and to some people, all jazz just sounds the same. It's just personal taste. So, I mentioned the Wilhelm scream earlier, and in all honesty, I often hate recognizing it in a film. It works okay in comedy films, but in anything I'm expected to take seriously, it can really just take me out of the moment. I'm sure lots of people agree with me on that, and I'm sure lots of people disagree with me on that. There's no right or wrong here, it's just personal taste. Catchphrases in TV series can be the same. There is, at best, a thin line between a catchphrase that works and one that annoys.
Are you having a laugh? Is she having a laugh?
Finally, we have our 3 lessons. 1. Repeat something that doesn't really work until it works better. 2. Repeat what has already been done. And 3. Be smart about it. So, I think the best demonstration of all 3 of these lessons in popular music is probably what we would call now, at least in rock, the Hendrix chord. So, the Hendrix chord is basically an altered dominant chord with a sharpened ninth. So, on guitar, take an E7. Play the ninth, which is an F sharp, and move it up a fret. That's the E7 sharp 9, or the Hendrix chord. What is particular though to the way that the Hendrix chord is used is that it isn't used as a dominant chord, it's used as the tonic. When it is used as a dominant, we just call it the E7 sharp 9. So why is this such a great example of all 3 lessons? Well, firstly, when used as the tonic, it tends to be consistently used as the tonic. It's a key part of the riff and the bluesy tonality of the song, and it's really leaned on. By repeating it as the tonic and really emphasizing it, your brain tells you, yes, this is the internal logic of the song. This is the tonic. We're not going anywhere from here. Secondly, Hendrix was just copying, or repeating, what he'd heard others do. He wasn't the first. It's named after him, not because he invented it, but because he, wait for it, repeated it a lot. It became a sort of internal logic to and culture within the music that he wrote. That's why we think of him first and foremost when it's used this way. Thirdly and finally, he recognized that to do this, you also need to understand the limitations of repeating yourself a lot. There's still a lot of room for variation. The way that he added riffs and fills around it, and the way that it is sometimes implied rather than simply him mashing the full chord. So, to sum it all up, we could actually sort of revise the original stolen... Dude, stop saying that. The original borrowed phrase, repetition legitimizes. This sort of understates what repetition, with variation, more broadly speaking, can do. Repetition doesn't merely legitimize, repetition is culture, it's society, it's everything we do. Let's say then that repetition... I'm not actually 100% sure how to sum it all up. Any ideas? Remember then that the act of repeating what has already been done is engaging with and developing culture. Repeating your own lyrics or music across different works develops your own culture, and it gives you a distinctive voice that is all your own. And when we repeat something that doesn't really work very well musically in a song we've written or a solo we're improvising, whether that's a mistake, something quite out there or dissonant or just not a very interesting idea, what we're kind of doing is creating a sort of microcosm of culture. A culture in a song where that idea or mistake does now make sense and it does sound good because we repeat it to the point of creating that logic that people can recognize even without knowing anything about music theory. This is how everything works. So go out there, steal people's ideas, steal your own ideas, keep repeating yourself, but do it all tastefully, judiciously, and legally. After all, that's what I did throughout this video.